I also imagined, I think the part of the reason why I was invited here are twofold. First of all, I was part of the advisory board of the U multi-rank feasibility study. At the time I was a student representative, so I was also involved in the creation of the U multi-rank. So I've also been asked to tell you something about that. But the implications part of my presentations also implies the fact that I work in the management of internationally excellent research organization. And I also want to tell you a bit about the implications of ranking as seen from our side. First of all, thank you also so much for the invitation and for hosting us here. This is a big honor. And I also think the topic is extremely relevant. And I think Israel and Norway, where I come from, is relevant, and we're comparable. I spoke to an Indian colleague, and he told me that when they do the census, when they count how many people that live in India, their error of margin is roughly 5 million. So you could take all of Norway and put it in India, and we still couldn't prove we were there. But I think it's a fair point that when you come from smaller countries, such as Norway, we don't have the same, let's call it muscle, the same size as, let's say, England, the US, or Germany. And that means that these types of tools become very relevant because all of a sudden we are compared. So if we move into talking about rankings, I would like to start with a quote of the famous Italian philosopher and statesman from the 1500s, Niccolo Machiavelli. Of course, most famous for writing the book The Prince. And in it, he has this quote. How we live is so different from how we ought to live that he who studies what ought to be done rather than what is done will learn the way to his downfall rather than his preservation. Now, the implications are this. If we want to study rankings and how they affect the higher education sector, we have to be realistic. We have to see how this occurs for us as academics and as managers. And rankings are important because people believe they are important. Even if we criticize rankings, the fact that they are there and that people use them makes them relevant. As also the previous speaker also said, several countries have policies based on their standing in a ranking. And high rankings are extensively used in marketing for new students if you have high scores. If you have low scores, you're more or less prone to challenge the methodology. But lastly, the topic of rankings, higher education quality, is essentially contested. So what rankings do is that they take something which is so hard to compare and explain and present it in an easy way. So what I will do is that I will try to break this presentation into three main parts. First, I will go through some key shortcomings of traditional rankings. And I think these shortcomings are critical because even though you're seeing that a lot of the big rankers, QS, Times Higher, etc., say they're changing a lot of the work they're doing, the underlying drivers, the composite indicators, the algorithms that they've spent decades building are still being used. So I will then present some different and some new approaches to ranking, of course, the U multi-rank as an example. And finally, I will also tell you a bit how we approached rankings as an institutions. And I will then also present my research institution, which is Similar Research Laboratory. So the fundamental problem with rankings is that they compare apples and pears. And they present these comparisons as facts. And let me give you 4 evidences why this is true. First of all, the input data in a lot of these rankings are quite unreliable, especially when they are self-reported. And I can say this with some degree of confidence because in a previous job, when I used to work at my university, I did this. I didn't even have a bachelor degree, and I was put on filling out these forms. So the input data can vary enormously across institutions. Secondly, the composite indicators that are used to generate these league tables are not official. Although some aspects of the rankers' criteria are public, the underlying things are not. However, this is a picture of a report that is written by a Norwegian research unit, and they decomposed all the composite indicators. And you can backtrack this. So if you then understand how the ranking works, and you control the data input, you can manipulate your score. And as one of the previous speakers said, of course, you shouldn't falsify data, but we're not talking about falsifying. We're talking about what is a student? Is it a full-time? Is it part-time? Do we exclude certain types of students? And let's say that the most of the students start in the early fall. After Christmas, several have dropped out. So you could argue that the latter instance after Christmas is a better example because that's the true student numbers. But that means you report a lower student number, your student to staff ratio improves, and your score increases. That is manipulation, but it's allowed if you understand how the system works. And I also know that we have emailed several of the rankers asking them, is it okay if we do it in this way? And they have replied, okay. So this is ranking sanctioned manipulation. Third, rankings are stupid. And unlike this guy, okay, stupid might be a strong word, but I have an example. This is a picture of George D. Hevesi, and he was born in Hungary. And he studied at the University of Budapest, Berlin, and ended up in Freiburg. His major scientific breakthrough in chemistry happened in Freiburg in the 1920s. After this, in 1935, he was hired by the University of Copenhagen in Denmark until 1943, where the situation for Jewish scientists in Denmark became intolerable, so he had to flee to Stockholm. The same year, 1943, only a couple of months after coming to Stockholm, he is awarded the Nobel Prize. And in the official statistics used to generate rankings today, his Nobel Prize counts as belonging to Stockholm University. So they went from 2 to 3 Nobel Prizes because of this. And the difference of one Nobel Prize can mean as much as 50 to 150 places on a ranking. We've seen this with London School of Economics and also with Hokkaido University in Japan very recently. And Stockholm University has one full Nobel Prize because of this. These two are last year's Norwegian, again I have to brag about my country, Norwegian Nobel laureates, the Moser couple, and they shared the Nobel Prize with a third person. So, and this was based on, I think, close to $100 million of Norwegian research spending, concentrated effort, building up one of the world's best groups in this over a long, long period of time. And that Nobel Prize counts as less than Stockholm's, just because he was there at the time when he received it. The final fundamental problem with rankings is not that you rank or that you use quantitative methods or statistics to measure quality. My training is in quantitative methods, so I really believe that it's possible to use numbers as indicators for quality. But the major problem is of scale. And allow me to give you an example. This has been mentioned earlier. Okay, so I'm from Norway. We're all crazy about cross-country skiing, especially female cross-country skiing, because we always win. So league tables are very useful in sports. So here you have the results of the 30K cross-country skiing in the previous Olympics in Russia in Sochi. If you look at the left part of the screen, you will see the actual results, the league table of results. Number 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. This is the top 10. If you look at the right column, that is how far behind they were. And as you see, there's a big variation between number 1 and number 2. There's a big gap between number 3 and number 4. So if you want to know how did these athletes perform, you should look at their time, not just the result to the left. The league tables produce mostly the information to the left. That's at least what's being quoted. So enough of the ranking bashing. Over to the different methodologies that you actually can use. The problem, as I started with traditional ranking, is that you compare apples with pears. The individual units that you have in your data set are not comparable. This is a picture of a grouping exercise done by the Norwegian Ministry of Higher Education, and it also assembles a European project called the UMAP, the mapping of universities. If you see the big green field in the bottom, it's very prevalent to the institution to the right. That's my old university, the University of Bergen. To the left, you have the Bergen University College. Now, this table does not say that one is better or the other. It tells that they're different. You cannot compare the research profile of a university with a research profile of a regional university college. This is a fundamental point. And very often when we discuss rankings, we neglect the fact that for most institutions, they're not that relevant. They're not useful because they don't say anything about profile. And as profiling instruments, we really get to where rankings can make a difference. So moving into the U-multi-rank. The U-multi-rank was set up as it started as a feasibility study initiated by the European Commission, completed by a consortium of researchers with heavy emphasis on genuine stakeholder participation. It also ended up in a scientific publication. I'm also going to be so bold as to highlight my own name here. I was part of the advisory group here, so I was able to follow this process quite closely. And it started as a genuine, of course, you acknowledge all of the challenges you're facing, but it was still driven by researchers that wanted to try to see, is this really possible? So fundamental to the U-multi-rank is that it's based on the assumption that there are no objective rankings, since the definition of quality varies. And this is a very, very important point. I'm going to say it one more time. There are no objective rankings. Times Higher Education rankings have their perception of quality, but they don't communicate it, and they say this is the fundamental list. U-multi-rank says quality varies depending on whose eyes you're watching. If you're a PhD student or a bachelor student or a business, you look for very different things. So, and they've also, and because of this, they don't make league tables. This is actually how the results are shown. So if you see so you remember this flower I showed earlier? They show more or less the same, but here how far out you are is related to performance, but only with comparable institutions. I'll come back to that. And also to the right, you see that the results are presented. So the green plot, if you can see it, is the institution in question here. And you can see actually the distribution of scores, not just as a league table, but how they're actually scored. So just to go through how this looks in practice, you can go into the website. This is some snapshots I collected yesterday. It's fully operational. But it depends. It starts with the fact that who do you want to compare? Do you want, either you can define a set of criteria and then it selects the institutions that are relevant, or you can compare with a given university. So for instance, I took my old university, the University of Bergen, and I clicked it, and the ranking said, okay, then we'll take that as a starting point and we'll compare your university to, with comparable institutions. Then you're taken to a side where you put down what indicators are important for you. And these are then the basis for the results page. And here, again, there's no definite league table, but it gives you an indication of which one is better. So again, the size of these green columns, and you can also sort it in different ways, the number of fully overperforming, and there are a lot of information. But again, the information is presented like this, not as a league table. But this was U-Multirank. U-Multirank is, as has been said earlier, it's relatively new. It has some challenges with some institutions finding it very hard to deliver all the data. It's also politicized, etc. So instead of just focusing on the implications of U-Multirank, I would also bring in some other perspectives that we see from the point of view of similar research laboratory. So we are a very young research organization. We were set up in 2001. We only have 153 employees, and we're owned by the Ministry of Education and Research. We get financing from a number of sources, but the fundamental purpose of our organization is to conduct really basic research within information and communication technologies. That means communication systems, applied mathematics, and software engineering. And of course, do research, education, and innovation. We're not located in a university. We're located in one of the major technology centers outside of Oslo, next to oil companies, telecommunication companies, and consultancies. Ever since we were set up, we were given very high ambitions in terms of science, and we have been repeatedly evaluated. And I would like to kind of emphasize how important evaluations can be in the context of rankings. Here you see the results from the previous 4 evaluations. We will be evaluated again next year in 2016. And I would also like to emphasize that we have consistently been able to improve on our scores, even though there have been new evaluation panels, etc. But that is because evaluations are useful. They tell you something that are directly related to you by people who understand your domain. And just to focus on the last generation, the previous evaluation in 2012, that was a national evaluation of all research groups in Norway that deals with information and communication technologies. The Research Council of Norway was the secretariat, and they headed the evaluation, and this was a genuine international evaluation. So what they did is that it was a very time-consuming process. You go through the self-evaluation, you send in the report, and then a committee comes. They spend a day with you, and they go through your publication, and they discuss. But in the end, they give you a set of recommendations, and they give you a score. They give you each research group in Norway received a score between 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest, 5 was the highest. The red bar you see in the middle is the national average. The orange scores are our results. So we have we performed very well in that evaluation. But what is interesting from a ranking perspective is that if you take this information and you group it by institution, you get something like this. You can read this as a league table. It shows you who's on top and who's at the bottom, but it shows you a lot more. It shows you your performance relative to the top performers, but also how you are against the national average. And this is also quite consistent over the year. And again, if this were a league table, the difference between an average score of 3 and an average score of 3.53 is not that much in terms of score, but in terms of number on a league table, it's a lot of places. So it gives you a better understanding of how you're actually performing as a research entity. And again, I just included the quote in the bottom from the evaluation committee that they said that we have been proactive in using the evaluation concerns and have implemented their recommendations, and this has led to improvements. You don't get that information from a ranking. But I also have to be honest, we have used institutional rankings ourselves. We currently, together with the University of Oslo, which is a good partner of ours, we have recently established a big research PhD educational program with the University of California in San Diego. And as you can see, here are some of their scores in the rankings, but we didn't pick them because of their ranking. We started by doing our homework, finding out which universities are relevant for us, and based on rankings, we made more or less a short list. And then we contacted them, and we didn't use the rankings afterwards. So institutional rankings can be useful just to make a first glance. Basically, if you get a number of applications for a position, the first walkthrough you can use the rankings, but from there on in, it's very hard to use it in a useful way. Another point I would like to make is that we conduct research at the really top international level within our very, very specific fields. And that is not visible in any of the institutional rankings. Perhaps we're too small, but we're a research institute, so since we're not a university, we're not included in any of the rankings. It's therefore a bit odd. So this is a colleague of mine. His name is Professor Magne Jørgensen, and he is the world's most productive researcher in systems engineering. And he has been ranked as the most productive researcher in this field for more than 10 years. So how do we know that he is the best researcher within the field? You don't read it out of any ranking, but the Journal of Systems of Software, one of the field-specific journals within our field, do these type of assessment at relatively infrequent intervals. And the reason why I like this approach is not because we're on top of it, but because it's a scientific publication. The Journal of System Software, they gave 4 researchers the task to conduct this exercise. They did the exercise, they publicized the data sources they used, the criteria they used, and how they made the ranking. And this was a peer-reviewed publication, open for academic scrutiny, and it's not presented as a matter of fact that this is the best researcher, no question about it, because we've said so, but they showed their method and their data and how they made the results. And for me, that makes all the difference. If you're open and transparent in how you're doing it, that means this type of approach to rankings. I can also mention the Google Scholar Age Index as being somewhat relevant to see at the individual level, but here we run into some of the same problems and challenges that ordinary rankings face. But then again, this is very, very targeted towards the number of publications and how cited they are. So we constantly, as a research institution trying to perform at the top international level, we need to know how we perform. Traditional rankings are not useful for this. And here are my three arguments. In order for rankings to be useful from an institutional side, they need to be trustworthy and relevant. To be trustworthy, they need to be open for scrutiny and clear about how they apply their criteria, which is not the case in most of the current setup. And to be relevant, they must be clear about the scope. And this is about comparing institutions with institutions that deserve to be compared with. And again, a word of warning. If you start using rankings to make very specific budgetary consequences, no matter what you say, institutions will always follow the funding situation. We saw that, but even if you see this in political analysis of funding systems, if you even introduce a small financial incentive, it has very big consequences. Connecting rankings and financing systems is a very, very slippery slope. I also think that in the end, it's the politicians who should decide, and rankings are nothing but information items. our deputy managing director, Mr. Kyrre Lekve, he used to be the deputy minister for higher education and research in Norway, and he held that position for 6 years. And in preparing this presentation, I discussed this with him, and he also said something quite interesting. He said that, as a word of warning, the ministries, we know that these rankings cannot be trusted because we know how poor the quality are. And at least for his side, the politicians today in Norway, they really don't put much emphasis on this. But he who has ever encountered a politician know that their views might change very rapidly. So I think, as a word of warning, rankings are nothing more than an information tool, and politicians should be clear that they are expected to make, for instance, budgetary decisions. This is not something left to media conglomerates like QS or Times Higher. So in summing up, we absolutely need to know how our institutions perform. This is crucial from a government perspective as well. We just need to make sure that the information we get is actually robust and reliable. And here we're into the fact that since quality is inherently subjective, the key is actually to be open about your approach and how you're doing it. And both politicians, and especially for academic institutions, they need to be clear about how they are going to benchmark their own performance and stick to it. At Simula, we decided that evaluations were the strategy we're going to pursue. We have not created, big type of rankings ourselves or used it. We use evaluations because they're useful, open, and they understand our field. Sometimes we disagree with their comments, but it's still a strategy, and we've stuck with it for close to 15 years now. And as ever, the devil is really in the details. And by that I mean, I would like to give a small example, an anecdote from when we created the U-Multi rank and we had the first discussions. The biggest discussions in the group was not about which indicators to use, how the approach was going to be, but it was about the business model. How was it sustainable? And you had a very strong pressure that said, but if we make a league table, we can sell it, we can get money, and that will sustain itself. So again, the point is, when you also move into your own, to make it relevant for Israel as well, make sure that you have an approach that is open and not connected directly to funding. Because if it is linked to funding, then you will have some very interesting challenges ahead of you. But thank you so much for your attention. And I've also been instructed that any questions or comments can be raised later in the plenary session. So thank you again.